2,000 years ago, an unstoppable empire met an immovable people. Rome's mighty legions had conquered most of Celtic Britain, except for the tribes of the far north. These were the Picts, fierce warriors who had forced the most powerful empire on earth to build the longest defensive structure in Europe, just to keep them out. 2,000 years ago, the Celtic peoples of northern Britain appear to have shared many similarities with their cousins, the tribes of southern Britain. Perhaps the most obvious sign of this was their similar style in Celtic art. They also appear to have spoken a similar language that was related to Brythonic, the ancestor of modern Welsh. There doesn't appear to have been any more difference between the Celts of northern and southern Britain than we would expect to find between Celts of any other region. But the northern tribes of 2,000 years ago still stand out for a very specific reason, as they posed an immovable obstacle to Roman ambitions. Where their southern cousins had succumbed to the ruthless machine of the empire, the northern tribes somehow never did. From their initial conquest of southern Britain in 43 AD, the Roman military had slowly but surely pushed further north, conquering new territory and bringing more Celtic tribes to heel. But by the first half of the 2nd century, they had reached a point beyond which they could no longer expand. As far as we know, there were several distinct tribes that held their territories across the far north, and for whatever reason, they were able to hold back one of the most successful empires in history. The Romans tried, and failed, several times to conquer this furthest part of Britain, and in the end decided to consolidate what they had. Hadrian's Wall, that great stone barrier stretching from coast to coast, was built during the 120s as a way of defending conquered land from the northern tribes. A generation later came the Antonine Wall that pushed as far north as the Romans would dare. But this was clearly an overreach by the empire, as it was abandoned only 20 years after its construction. Both of these walls speak of a profound Roman anxiety, of fierce foes to the north who were too dangerous to leave unchecked. And between the walls lay more than just contested ground. It was in many ways a space between two worlds. A traveller crossing these boundaries would have noticed a marked difference. To the south lay the signs of Roman industry, paved roads connecting towns and markets, ships sailing to distant ports, the machinery of empire grinding ever onward. But north of the wall there were instead ancient paths and trackways that wound between hill forts where chieftains held court in the old way, maintaining bonds of loyalty through generous gift-giving rather than imperial decree. The urban centres of the south, especially where the imperial government and military were stationed, had borrowed the trappings of Mediterranean civilization. The Celtic tribes of the south still maintained their cultures and traditions, but those in power also had to adopt Roman ways, and over time came to submit to the imperial peace. But this never happened in the north. These two worlds met at a wall that would come to symbolise far more than a simple frontier. This appears to be the period when there was a decisive break between the Celts of Roman Britain and their distant cousins to the north. It's almost certain that there would have been diversity across the Celtic tribes in terms of traditions and customs, while there would also have been a degree of coherence between them all. But whether or not there was an inherent difference between the northern and southern Celts before the Romans, after the empire's invasion, there would have been an increasing separation of these Celtic people, meaning their culture would begin to evolve along distinct paths. Long before Christianity reached Scotland, the early Picts were using sacred sites built with mathematical precision, not just to honour their gods, but to track the stars and planets across the heavens. And what they left behind is more than just stone, it's a prehistoric observatory that still works to this day. The history of the Picts is a long and complicated story, and most of what we know of them is based on other people's accounts. None of their myths or traditional lore has survived, so it's difficult to know what their culture was like or what they thought of themselves and the world they lived in. But there are a few tentative sources that we can use to at least guess at what the early Picts believed. In the 2nd century of the Common Era, the renowned Greek author Ptolemy wrote a book on the geography of the Roman world, and in it he attempted to locate the different tribes who lived at that time in northern Britain. In doing so, he provided a brief glimpse of these northern peoples, including many of their tribal names. In modern-day Aberdeenshire, he located a tribe called the Texali, a name that might mean something like the Hatchet people. Ptolemy also recorded the name of their most important town as being Dervana. No one has yet been able to identify where this town was located, but there's a good chance it was somewhere around modern Aberdeen and the valley of the River Don. Over the last few decades, there have been many significant archaeological discoveries in this area, but perhaps one of the most fascinating, and one which gives us a rather stunning insight into the world of the early Picts, is a piece of research that attempts to understand the significance of ancient Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments. Near the village of Hatton-on-Fintray stands an ancient ritual landscape. It's made up of a network of prehistoric monuments that appears to have been carefully positioned to track celestial movements and serve as a stage for sacred ceremonies, not only for the early Picts, but for their ancestors in the Iron Age and earlier. The central feature of this landscape is the Gookstone, a 3-metre granite monolith whose name comes from the Old English word for cuckoo. It stands on a gentle slope above the River Don, marking what appears to have been a significant gathering place for countless generations. The stone itself bears no carvings or symbols, but its placement was far from random. The Gookstone is part of a larger sacred landscape including 6 monuments that can all be seen from each other. 4 cairns, the standing stone itself, and a stone circle. These monuments were all positioned to act as horizon markers when viewed from one another, creating sight lines that track the movements of celestial bodies across long epochs of time. David Nance, the archaeologist who interpreted the site and uncovered the various alignments, has collected many different pieces of evidence to suggest what types of ceremonies were being held here, and we'll look in more detail at his ideas on the Picts course on the Celtic Source website. David Nance's theories may be highly speculative, but he makes good use of the available sources in Celtic myth and archaeology. If you want to look at those ideas yourself, you'll find the original paper linked below, or you're welcome to come and discuss them with us on the course. To give you a taste of David Nance's ideas, it's worth just focusing on a few aspects of his research. This complex of monuments can all be found in the landscape around the tiny village of Hatton-on-Fintray in the valley of the River Don. As historical linguists have pointed out, the river name is derived from the earlier Celtic word Diwana, simply meaning goddess. This suggests the Pictish Texali tribe and their ancestors may well have experienced the river as an embodiment of a local deity. In this, the early Picts were no different to other Celtic peoples, as we find similar river names in Wales and across Europe. There is another local name that perhaps confirms this interpretation. To the southwest of the Gookstone stands Cairn Tradlin Farm, the cairn of the name telling us that this was once the site of one of the monuments of the ritual complex. The second part of the farm name is Tradlin, a name that has a rather complex history of its own, but it's also a local version of the name for a Saint Triduana. A little way to the north of Cairn Tradlin Farm we find Kinella Parish Church, where once stood an earlier church consecrated to this same Saint Triduana, and embedded in the churchyard's south wall stand two great flanking stones that were once part of a stone circle, an ancient sacred site taken over by the early church. Saint Triduana's name can be derived from a few different sources. In Latin, it would translate as 3 days, but Duana is also very close to the original name for the river close by, implying that if we can derive her name from the Brythonic, it could be that Saint Triduana is a Christianized version of the river goddess. The tree in Triduana can also be understood as the Celtic tree, that is, 3, giving us something like 3 goddess. That is, a triple goddess, a type of deity found elsewhere in both Celtic myth and archaeology. Now, just to be clear, I am not a historical linguist, so a bit more research would be needed to confirm this theory, and given that there's already a clear Latin meaning to her name, makes this theory just a little bit more tenuous. There are several churches and other religious sites connected with Saint Triduana, and Christian biographers claim she was a 4th century woman originally from Greece. But that said, we also know that early Christianity had a habit not only of building churches on older pagan sites, as we find with Kinella Church, but also at times of reinventing pagan deities as saints. The implication is their religious leaders were intentionally portrayed as embodiments of, or at least in the lineage of, a local deity, much as I suggested with St. Bridget in the last video. If this is the case, Triduana could therefore be a Latinized version of the earlier Brythonic title for the river goddess. As we discuss on the course, there are significant astrological alignments that are preserved in this complex of monuments. Several of them mark significant moments in the cycles of the moon, while others mark important moments in the solar year. One in particular aligns with Venus at Samhain or Calan Gaeaf, presenting us with an intriguing moment in the ritual year for ceremonies. Of course, we really don't know precisely what the Druids of the Texali tribe were doing at these ancient monuments, but they could well have been engaged in ancient rituals that had been evolving for hundreds, if not thousands of years. If any of these theories are correct, it shows us once again how the Picts were quite similar to other Celtic peoples of the time, worshipping river goddesses with similar names and using ancient sites for their own ceremonies. These basic similarities between Pictish culture and their Brythonic cousins in southern Britain offers us some way of understanding some of the most mysterious objects in Pictish culture, those being the symbol stones that are found all over the Pictish territories. As yet, no one has been able to decode what these enigmatic symbols mean, but one way of interpreting them is to see how these symbolic animals in particular were understood in both ancient Welsh and Irish culture. There may well be some common meaning, especially when we see these symbols used by both the early Irish and Welsh. There's a good chance we can apply the same understanding to the enigmatic symbols of the Picts. Imagine writing the history of an entire people without ever meeting them. Well, that's exactly what the ancient Romans did with the Picts of northern Britain. As we're about to discover, that's why separating fact from fiction about these legendary warriors isn't a simple matter. Beyond some tribal names that were recorded by the Romans, we don't know if these northern tribes identified themselves as one people. In fact, it's unlikely. If the other Celtic tribes are anything to go by, it's doubtful they ever thought of themselves as anything more than a loose confederation of larger tribes, working together as and when they needed. Picti was first used by writers who lived far away in Rome, distant commentators who had heard strange tales about the barbarians who lived beyond the northernmost frontiers of the empire. To these classical authors, Picti literally meant the painted people. Now, this could have been a nickname given to them by the Roman soldiers who had to deal with them, or perhaps it was a Roman misunderstanding of a tribal name. Either way, those who wrote about the Picts from distant Rome appear to have had no first-hand knowledge of them. Many of the earliest written descriptions of the Picts appear to draw on fantasy as much as fact. For example, the Roman author Herodian is generally regarded as an unreliable historian at best. Writing towards the beginning of the 3rd century, he describes an encounter with the northern barbarians. Most of Britain is marshland because it is flooded by the continual ocean tides. The barbarians usually swim in these swamps or run along in them, submerged up to the waist. Of course, they are practically naked and do not mind the mud because they are unfamiliar with the use of clothing, and they adorn their waists and necks with iron, valuing this metal as an ornament and a token of wealth in the way that other barbarians value gold. They also tattoo their bodies with various patterns and pictures of all sorts of animals. Hence the reason why they do not wear clothes, so as to cover the pictures on their bodies. They are very fierce and dangerous fighters, protected only by a narrow shield and a spear, with a sword slung from their naked bodies. It's worth pointing out that this brief description of Britain appears to be a rather simplistic one, and whereas we know the northern Celts wore torques around their necks, like their southern cousins, archaeologists are yet to find torques large enough to be worn around the waist, or metalwork even worn on belts. At best, Herodian's information appears to be second-hand. It's also more than possible that the belief these northern tribes were tattooed in some way was simply based on the name Picti, a name which could easily have been given to these peoples by the Romans themselves. Earlier Roman writers, Julius Caesar being one of them, had noted that the Celts of southern Britain would paint themselves blue, but only Caesar himself had actually ever met the British Celts. While some tribes may have had such a practice, it could well be the case that simply based on Caesar's single account, these later Roman authors assumed that this was common amongst all the barbarian tribes of Britain. Based on the unreliable nature of the evidence we have, the jury is still out on whether the Picts really were painted people. When an 18th century Highland chief gathered his clan, he was following traditions that may have been older than Scotland itself. The story of Britain's northern tribes isn't just about resisting Rome. It's about a way of life so powerful it survived for thousands of years. It's highly unlikely that these tribal peoples were anything like the primitive barbarians of the Roman imagination. They were warlike and aggressive, of course, as was every other group of people that wished to preserve some autonomy in that violent age. But they were also the inheritors of traditions that reached back at least into the Bronze Age, if not to the Neolithic. Like the other tribal peoples of Europe, they would have carried forward customs and practices that had served their ancestors well for millennia. Their society was sophisticated in its own right, organised around principles that would prove remarkably durable. According to some historians, aspects of their way of life survived in recognisable form into the Highland clan system of the 18th century. At the heart of this social order was the tribe itself, a community that may have been unified at times by claimed descent from a common ancestor. Unlike the feudal systems that would later dominate Europe, tribal authority rested not on titles granted from above, but on the complex web of relationships between kin. Leadership appears to have been earned rather than inherited, though bloodlines still carried weight. A chief's position depended on the continued support of their people, who saw themselves not as subjects, but as members of an extended family. The Romans noted with some surprise that these societies operated on surprisingly democratic principles. The Roman historian Dio Cassio observed that they chose their boldest men as rulers, suggesting a meritocracy that stood in stark contrast to Rome's hereditary nobility. This system persisted in the later clan structure, where chiefs could be deposed if they failed to meet their people's expectations. Even the lowest-ranking member of a clan maintained their individual dignity, conscious always of their place in the ancestral lineage. Warfare and raiding clearly played a central role in tribal life, but these were not merely acts of violence or plunder. They served as proving grounds for leadership and as economic mechanisms for redistributing wealth, particularly in the form of cattle. The practice of cattle raiding, far from being simple theft, was a rather sophisticated cultural institution that survived well into the historical period. It's likely that young men were expected to prove themselves through such ventures, following patterns of behaviour that archaeologists and anthropologists have traced throughout the Indo-European world. Perhaps most remarkable was the continuity of these social structures. When the Romans withdrew from Britain, the tribal societies of the north continued largely unchanged. Even as Christianity arrived and new political structures emerged, the fundamental principles of tribal organisation remained. The later Highland clans were not a medieval invention, but the direct inheritors of this ancient system, preserving its essential features even as the world around them changed. This continuity amongst the early Pictish tribes also encompasses sacred sites and religious practices. Their ancestors had marked the landscape with stone circles and burial mounds and other monuments. Many of these places retained their importance even as beliefs changed, with Christian churches often being built on sites that had been sacred to earlier generations. The practice of building on such sites was not mere convenience, but represented a deep understanding of how physical spaces retain their power across centuries. The legacy of the Picts still lasts today, not only in the clans of extended families, but in the very landscape itself.